Hello and welcome to South Asia Chat, a podcast series brought to you by the Institute of South Asian Studies at the National University of Singapore. My name is Saeed. I'm a research analyst here, and I will be your host for today's episode, which looks at the European Union's Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism scheme. This scheme has emerged as the latest development within the intersection of environmental sustainability and trade. Also known as CBAM, it is geared at preventing carbon leakage and encouraging decarbonisation in production and manufacturing within and outside the European Union. It does so by imposing a carbon tax on goods from specific sectors. This will in turn raise the cost of carbon-intensive imported goods in the European Union. Naturally, this has important implications for its trading partners, particularly in the developing world, where environmental standards and decarbonization practices tend to lag behind the developed countries. With the phased implementation of the scheme set to begin later this year, it is a good time to gauge where India stands with respect to this policy. And to discuss this, we are delighted to have with us Dr. Amitendu Palit, Senior Research Fellow and Research Lead Trade and Economics at the Institute of South Asian Studies here at the National University of Singapore. Welcome to the podcast, Dr. Palit.
Thank you, Said. Very happy to talk to you on this subject.
I will start off with a context setting question because there are several aspects of the scheme that can be explored in much detail. What essentially is the policy and what does it aim to address? Because we see it as a well-intentioned policy from the EU. However, the implications that it kind of carries for developing countries are significant. So how do you look at that?
Thank you for asking that question, Said. I think, as you mentioned in your opening context setting, the carbon border adjustment mechanism, which is finally going to become operational from the first week of October this year, and then eventually coming into force in about 3 years' time from then, is going to be the first policy regulation of its kind, and it's unique in the sense that it is actually going to price emissions by putting a tariff on the borders. Now, as we all know, in the past, we have had instances of governments trying to discourage emission intensity in cross border trade by introducing what is typically called trading allowances. And these trading allowances enable businesses who are exporting or importing to bid for specific allowances and permits which work on the basis of a macro target. So let us say, for example, if the European Union, which had a very well settled emission trading scheme, if the European Union had put in place an emission target of 100 units of greenhouse gases, then within that 100 unit of cap, there would have been trading certificates that would have been put up for sale, and those trading certificates would have been bought by the importers and exporters, and these certificates would have allowed specific amounts of GHG emissions, and more importantly, they would have also been able to exchange these certificates between themselves. So it's almost like holding on to share certificates which can be traded across the borders. But what the European Union is doing through the CBAM is a bit different. It is different because it is phasing out the existing emission trading scheme that we just discussed. And it is actually going to move into a system of pricing carbon emission. And what that would mean is that there will be a domestic price of carbon emission as determined by the EU regulatory authorities for carbon emitted within the territory of the European Union. And the idea behind the CBAM is that the price of carbon as embedded in the products that are entering the European Union should be at least equal to, if not less, than the domestic price of carbon within the territory of the European Union. And in a number of cases, the expectation is that these carbon prices that are coming into the European Union through imports are going to be higher than the domestically determined price of carbon within the European Union. And that is where the CBAM's main instrument is going to be activated. These particular items, which have carbon content that are higher than what the EU will be prescribing, will be subject to a tax. And that tax will be determined by the differential between what the European Union price of the carbon is and the threshold that it permits and the corresponding carbon threshold of the imports that are coming into the European Union. Now, why is this significant? It is significant because there are a large number of products that are entering the European Union which are strongly carbon intensive, and the legislation behind the CBAM actually highlights these products. So let's say, for example, industries like iron, steel, aluminium, fertilizers, several hydrocarbon industries, including hydrogen, have high carbon content. And that carbon content, when compared with the domestic price of carbon within the European Union, is actually going to become eligible for imposition of this tariffs or the taxes on the border. And the implication of that will be that when these products enter the European Union, they're going to be that much more expensive. So as a result of which, there is going to be a loss of competitive advantage for the exporters of these products into the European Union, and that will have some impact on the trade relationships in terms of the countries that are big exporters to the European Union of these carbon intensive products. While that is the first implication, the second implication is that in many ways, with respect to controlling emissions, this will become a trend setting regulation. So the European Union, much as it had done earlier in the case of cross-border data management through the General Data Protection Regulations, the GDPR, is also taking a step forward to establish potential global regulations that would encourage more other territories like the European Union to impose similar carbon taxes on their borders. So, for developing countries, which are big exporters of carbon intensive products to a large number of the developed country markets like the European Union, there is this concern that once these taxes become effective, they're actually going to adversely affect the trade prospects.
Thank you for that really comprehensive outlook of the policy. I think that was a really good explainer. And before I go to how this intersects with India's trade, I would want to come to the trade relationship aspect that you mentioned with developing countries, because a lot of developing countries have expressed opposition to the policy, such as, in fact, the BRICS had come out with a statement against it as well. And some countries also plan to challenge the scheme within the WTO. So, do you think that these countries may have a case within the framework of the World Trade Organization?
That again, I think, is a very good point because we will probably not be able to, frankly, figure out whether this is WTO compliant or not, though the general view across the trade community and the trade policy expert appears to be that this is not exactly WTO compliant, because while the WTO does allow uh, members to apply certain discretionary measures on their borders on the grounds of national security and similar concerns, the CBAM is actually a planned move to discourage carbon emissions. And if to that extent the European Union argues that this is equivalent to taking measures which are protective of its national security, then it can forcefully present a case of the measure being WTO compliant. Because in that case, the argument of the European Union will be that environmental security is a very important part of national security and greater concerns that impact the life and well being of its citizens. So it is moving to that step. So, to that extent, this issue will be left out for investigation. But my concern over here is that with the WTO's appellate body still not functional, because of the reluctance of the United States to appoint judges on the appellate tribunal, a ruling in this case, which is likely to go up to the appellate body and find that body non functional, a ruling on this case is going to be very distant in the foreseeable future. And we also need to take note of the fact that this measure is not going to kick in before another 3 years. Sorry, another 2 years, 2026. But before that, what is actually going to be an onerous task for a lot of exporters is that beginning from the first week of October, that is next month, the importers into the European Union will have to furnish a lot of information that is required by the European Union authorities with respect to the carbon content of these products. Now, this is where I suspect that developing countries might have a chance of actually going to the WTO and raising some questions over the nature of the information and data that has been asked from them, because in a number of cases, such information might amount to disclosing somewhat sensitive commercial information about their production. So, in that case, they might have a ground to actually argue that the European Union really is not in a position to demand such kind of data. And I think this is a legitimate concern. It's not a question of not disclosing the right data, but it's a question of simplifying the reporting requirements. Because if today this becomes the norm, and developing countries by and large are expected to comply with this in more OECD country markets that they trade with, then the reporting requirement, the data disclosure requirement, and the back-end work is going to become that much more. And all these are going to increase costs of exporters. So basically, in that respect, this becomes an anti-trade facilitation exercise, which means that if there are trade facilitation benefits that have been obtained through digitalization of processes and so on and so forth, this acts in the opposite direction by bringing in new elements of cost. So whatever cost saving was achieved earlier through better trade facilitation now gets neutralized through a new set of cost additive steps.
Thank you for raising those really interesting points, and it will be also interesting to see how this plays out in the WTO when it comes to that. Moving on to India, the European Union is a major trading partner for the country, and particularly for industries like iron and steel and cement, which are under the ambit of the CBAM scheme. What kind of an impact are Indian industries anticipating?
I think, as you mentioned, Said, that the iron and steel and aluminium exports by India to the European Union is significantly large. And to that extent, beginning with the kind of reporting requirements that Indian exporters to the European Union of these products will have to face from about a fortnight onward, is going to be the beginning of a new series of requirements. These are fresh, these are first time, and there's going to be some difficulty, clear difficulty in adjusting to these reporting requirements. Now, as I understand from a variety of steps which the government has taken, the government of India in this instance, over the last few months, is to sensitize the Indian industry to the fact that these requirements are in the pipeline. There is not going to be any deviation from them. So, exporters to the European Union of carbon sensitive products need to get used to these reporting requirements. But it is obviously not going to be very easy because, as we just discussed, the character of reporting is something which is very new, and to what extent many exporters, particularly the SMEs, will have the ability to comply with these requirements is definitely something which is worth considering. The second point is that if we purely look at the statistical concept and the aspects of India European Union trade, there is no doubt about the fact that a substantive part of the trade is actually the metals and minerals trade, which essentially reflects upon the iron, steel, aluminium, and these categories, and also the refined fuel, uh, which has been an important part of the trade, the refined petroleum products. Now, the point over here to note is that the CBAM is actually an interesting regulation in the fact that CBAM would want the exporters to not only disclose the direct content of GHG emissions in their products, but also the indirect content of their exports, and which basically means that, let's say, for example, if we are considering iron and steel exports, it's not just how much carbon is embedded in these iron and steel exports, but also on account of the electricity and the fuel that has been consumed for producing these iron and steel in their making during the supply chain operations, and to what extent that production has contributed to generation of GHGs. Now, this by itself is not an easy requirement to comply with, simply because of the fact that, given the kind of country that India is, reporting across industrial operations is something which is very heterogeneous across industries. So, let's say, for example, industries like automobiles might have a particular kind of reporting structure within them, which might be totally absent from an industry like fertilizers, which will invite reporting demands from the European Union because of their carbon sensitivity, and might be handicapped by the fact that domestically they really don't have that kind of a reporting system on how much they're emitting and what are the indirect emissions as well. So this is not going to be a very easy situation to sort of live and exist in. But this is not just an India specific concern. This is a concern which will resonate across a large number of other exporters to the European Union of the products that are invited under the CBAM for tariff imposition.
Those are some really important issues that you highlighted. And the Indian government has consistently expressed its concerns regarding the scheme and how it may respond. So now that we are getting closer to the date when the policy rolls out, what are some of the ways that the Indian government plans to respond to the CBAM policy? And I think it's also interesting that at the same time, India is also negotiating a foreign trade agreement with the European Union. So, how do you think these things might intersect?
I think till now the reactions that have come from India, and I'm not talking about government reactions, I'm generally talking about industry responses, stakeholder reactions, so on and so forth, can be divided broadly into two categories. The first category is more of a panic reaction, which kind of converges on the fact that this is a very discriminatory step that has been taken by the European Union. It's really going to badly affect the prospects of certain specific exports from India into the European Union. And as a result of that, India should respond with some retaliatory action, either in terms of imposing tariffs on European Union exports into India or something similar of that nature. So it's basically advocating a tit for tat response. We are aware of several examples of tit for tat responses in the field of trade in recent times. And curiously, steel and aluminium have been at the forefront of this tit for tats. You will recall that this was one of the first steps that President Trump had taken in the United States when he wanted to discourage greater import of steel and aluminium into the United States. And along with a large number of other countries, India had responded to the higher tariffs by imposing tariffs on US exports into the India. So I'm not exactly sure whether that might again be the line of action to be taken. But what I think is important to note is that till now, the European Union has not shown any inclination to budge on this particular requirement, and which means they're pretty serious in going about it. And the second point, which I think I mentioned earlier on during our conversation, is that down the line, there is a strong possibility, given the very high priority that environmental and sustainable governance now has in today's world, and the way the corporate sector and businesses are going about in imbibing these principles into their functioning, there is this very high probability of many other markets shifting to systems that are similar, like the CBAM. So, in that case, for a country like India, one of the requirements needs to be to figure out that what can be done domestically to ensure that there is better compliance with the kind of rules that CBAM is going to institutionalize, and what might become more sort of visible norms in other markets as well. Now, one of the possibilities in this regard is that if India is able to initiate a system of pricing carbon and taxing the same within its own domestic territory and have that certified by the EU agencies, then I think that will be a fairly decisive and purposeful step. What that essentially means, and let me try to simplify this by saying that if there are domestic taxes imposed on carbon emission for certain products within India, and these are those products which are typically more carbon intensive and which in the European Union as well are going to attract high taxes on the borders, then that offers Indian authorities and Indian businesses an opportunity to present their case to the European Union and say that, look, we have already taxed these products within our country, so there cannot be a question of they being taxed on European borders for a second time, and that element has been well taken care of. If even then there are other GHG issues, those can be discussed bilaterally or in a bigger setting. And to my mind, the most effective forum for checking out this possibility or other similar possibilities is the Indian European Union bilateral discussions. And I think there is also this trade and technology cooperation agenda under which India and the European Union are discussing a number of things. The India EU FTA till now has been proceeding fairly well. There are many challenges which these negotiations are encountering, but I think if some of these issues, and among them the question of the carbon border adjustment mechanism is very important, if some of these are addressed upfront, then it will only be beneficial for Indian industries, enterprises, and businesses from a long term sustainability perspective, because they are going to face more and more of these regulations across major markets of the world.
Thank you for that answer, Dr. Palit. And I think you alluded to a really important point, that how other countries, other developed countries, might follow suit and come up with their own border adjustment mechanisms as well. And I think what a question that rises from that is that what is the kind of what are the wider implications of such policies in the future of world trade? We have more countries, if they introduce measures like this, how this kind of ties into the whole global north and global south imbalance debate, and similar, those wider implications. So, what do you think about that?
Said, I think we need to look at it from two vantage points. The first is that from a European Union public policy perspective, this is not an isolated move, because if we look at the European Union Fit for 2050 agenda, the CBAM is a part of that agenda, along with other significant regulations like the deforestation regulation and also discouraging subsidies that go behind carbon intensive production. On the other hand, we also need to look carefully at the fact that today, if one looks at the global north south trade, and if we specifically look at a country like India, for example, India clearly is not one of the largest per capita emitters of the world. Those per capita emissions vary across a large number of other countries, but India's specific concern with the CBAM is because of its application to certain products which are high value Indian exports to the European Union. The question that arises over here is that when you are looking at trade relations that by now have been systemized across the world to get functional according to the demands of environmental sustainability, then that is a priority which cannot be overlooked, while at the same time accepting the fact that there are significant challenges on part of developing countries in trying to adjust to that. Now, I would personally feel that even from the European Union side, it is important to enter into more long term and in depth dialogues on this subject. Like, say, for example, it's not just the reporting requirements that exporters would be complying with, but it is also the question of how the European Union is actually arriving at the determination of its domestic carbon price. There are the regulation mentions that there will be a process of auction and so on and so forth, but that methodology itself is something which is very European Union specific. I think it is important for such methodologies to become much wider and all embracing. And perhaps one can even look at the possibility of this being discussed, if not within the WTO, then certainly within the broader G20 community, for arriving at an appropriate methodology for domestically pricing carbon across the world, given the fact that pricing of carbon is now turning out to be one of the most influential public policy measures for discouraging greater production of carbon intensive measures. So, till that happens, the bigger question that will remain is that from a European Union's perspective, is this something which is, turning out to be a measure which is basically discriminatory in terms of the interests that it has pursued? Nobody is denying the fact that addressing climate issues is extremely important, and nobody is also denying the fact that the European Union has taken a head start in that regard. But whether this eventually will turn out to be a system where a certain part of the trade, because of its carbon character, gets snatched off and diverted from entering the European Union territory and is replaced by products from other countries with whom the European Union regulations and methods are more, sharply aligned, that is a concern which is going to remain. And if that concern turns out to be true, then obviously there's going to be a sharper divide among the global north and the global south in terms of the trade relationship. But that's something which is best avoidable, because I personally feel that within the global south, there are countries, not just India, but many other countries who really are well committed to the idea of sustainable development, combating climate. But this is where again the bigger question of special but differentiated responsibilities, which has always been a recurring theme in global climate conversations, needs to be also looked into a bit more carefully and seriously when it comes to the question of trading across borders in carbon products.
Thank you, Dr. Palit. From what I gather, I think there are several nuances and more particular details of the scheme which will be fleshed out in the coming years until the policy is fully implemented and perhaps even beyond that. But thank you so much for engaging in this conversation and sharing your insights on this subject with us today.
My pleasure. Thank you very much, Said.
You were listening to South Asia Chat. You can learn more about our work at isas.nus.edu.sg. You can also find our publications and events on social media. We are available on Twitter, LinkedIn, Facebook, and Instagram.